Empress Theodora thought her most dangerous enemies lived beyond the palace walls, but the real threat was breathing down her neck at the dinner table. In 548 AD, a single glance across a banquet hall would trigger a conspiracy so twisted that it would reshape an empire. What happened in those shadowed corridors wasn't just political maneuvering. It was psychological warfare that makes modern power games look like children's puzzles. The great hall of the sacred palace trembled with the weight of unspoken threats. Empress Theodora sat perfectly still at the high table, her fingers wrapped around a goblet of wine she hadn't touched in an hour. The golden cup had grown warm in her hands, but her attention was fixed on something far more dangerous than Thracian vintage. The subtle theatre of betrayal playing out before her eyes. It was the spring of 54-48 AD, and Constantinople buzzed with rumours of plague moving westward from Egypt. But inside these marble walls, decorated with mosaics that seemed to watch every movement, a different kind of contagion was spreading. The disease of ambition, the fever of conspiracy, and Theodora, who had survived the brothels and bear pits of her youth, could smell it in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The banquet had been arranged to celebrate the completion of the Hagia Sophia's restoration, but nobody was talking about architecture. Instead, conversations died the moment she looked in their direction. Laughter stopped mid-note when her shadow fell across a group. These were her allies, her carefully cultivated network of supporters who owed their positions to her influence. Yet tonight, they watched her with the calculating eyes of strangers. General Belisarius sat 3 seats down from the emperor, his weathered hands cutting meat with the precision of a man who had carved up barbarian armies across 3 continents. But his wife Antonina, positioned strategically at the women's table, kept glancing toward the eastern entrance, as if expecting someone, or something. Her normally confident demeanor had developed a nervous edge, like a cat that senses an approaching storm. The palace eunuch Narcissus moved between tables with his characteristic gliding walk, refilling cups and whispering pleasantries. But Theodora noticed how his route carefully avoided her section of the hall. For a man whose entire career depended on reading the subtle currents of palace politics, this was not an oversight. This was a statement. Emperor Justinian, her husband and the supposed master of half the known world, remained blissfully unaware of the invisible chess game happening around him. He discussed theology with a group of bishops, his voice animated with the passion he reserved for religious debates. In his mind, the greatest threats to their empire came from distant barbarians or theological heretics. He couldn't see that the real danger was sharing his dinner table. The servants moved like shadows between the guests, but Theodora had trained herself to notice shadows. She saw how certain plates took longer to be cleared, how specific conversations were accidentally overheard by passing staff, how messages seemed to travel through the hall without any visible messenger. The palace had always been a place where walls had ears, but tonight those ears seemed to be listening for something specific. A burst of laughter drew her attention to the far end of the hall, where several young senators were raising toasts to the glory of Rome eternal. But their eyes kept flicking toward her, and she caught the way one of them made a subtle gesture with his wine cup. A signal she had seen before, in less civilized settings, when men wanted to communicate without words. The musical entertainment began, and a group of court musicians struck up a popular melody about faithful love and eternal devotion. The irony was so thick it seemed to darken the air. As the singer's voice rose in praise of loyalty and trust, Theodora noticed how many of her guests found sudden interest in their food, or their neighbor's jewelry, anything to avoid meeting her eyes during a song about faithfulness. But what disturbed her most wasn't what she could see, it was what she couldn't see. 3 regular attendees were notably absent tonight. The court physician claimed illness. The prefect of the city had urgent business elsewhere. The head of the palace guard was reportedly investigating a disturbance in the outer districts. 3 separate excuses for 3 separate men who had never missed a palace function in 5 years. As the evening wore on, Theodora felt the familiar weight of isolation that had haunted her since childhood. In the brothels of her youth, at least the dangers were honest. Men wanted your body, or your money, and they were straightforward about their intentions. But here in the sacred palace, surrounded by silk and gold and the finest minds of the empire, the threats came wrapped in smiles and sealed with kisses of peace. The empress had learned long ago that survival meant seeing what others missed. Tonight, she was seeing the careful choreography of a conspiracy so sophisticated that it made her old street-level schemes look like children's games. Someone had been planning this for months, maybe years. They had studied her habits, identified her weaknesses, and were now moving all their pieces into position for a final strike. But what Theodora didn't know was that the real conspiracy had been in motion for 3 years. And the dinner she was attending wasn't just a social gathering, it was the final test to see if their most dangerous enemy suspected anything at all. The sacred palace wasn't just a residence, it was a machine designed to manufacture paranoia. Every corridor had been engineered by architects who understood that power required performance, and performance required an audience that could never be certain when they were being watched. Theodora knew these halls better than anyone alive. She had walked them as a supplicant, crawled them as a seeker of favor, and now ruled them as an empress. But tonight, returning to her private chambers after the dinner, she moved with the careful steps of someone who had rediscovered fear. The walls themselves were weapons. Byzantine engineers had perfected the art of acoustic surveillance 3 centuries before her birth. Hidden chambers behind seemingly solid marble allowed conversations to be overheard from rooms away. Carefully angled mirrors, disguised as decorative elements, reflected activities from impossible angles. The famous Room of Whispers in the Eastern Wing could capture a spoken word from 50 feet away and deliver it, crystal clear, to a listener positioned in what appeared to be an entirely different building. But the physical architecture was only half the story. The real masterpiece was the psychological environment that these spaces created. Children born in the palace learned to lie before they learned to walk properly. Not from malice, but from necessity. Truth was a luxury that could get you killed. Honesty was a weakness that others would exploit without hesitation. Every piece of furniture had been positioned with strategic purpose. The placement of chairs determined who could make eye contact during conversations. The height of tables established subtle hierarchies that affected how information flowed through a room. Even the patterns in the floor mosaics served as silent communication tools. Step on the wrong symbol, and you had just sent a message to anyone who knew how to read the code. Theodora paused at the junction of 2 corridors, apparently studying a fresco of saints, but actually listening to the almost inaudible conversation bleeding through the wall from the chamber beyond. 2 voices, speaking in Greek so rapid and whispered that most people would have dismissed it as meaningless noise. But she had learned to decode the language of conspiracy during her years climbing from the gutter to the throne. After the Egyptian matter is resolved, can't afford to wait if the plague reaches. Antonina believes the timing is. The voices faded as their speakers moved deeper into the room, leaving Theodora with fragments that felt like puzzle pieces from different boxes. But she had enough to confirm what her instincts had been screaming during dinner. This wasn't random court gossip or casual political maneuvering. This was coordination, this was planning, this was war. The palace had always been a place where alliances shifted like Mediterranean weather. But there were rules to the game, unspoken agreements about how far you could push before pushing back. Tonight, she sensed those rules had been abandoned. Someone had decided that the normal restraints of palace politics no longer applied. She continued toward her chambers, but took the route that passed through the portrait gallery, a seemingly innocent detour that actually allowed her to observe the patterns of movement throughout the building. Who was visiting whom? Which rooms had lights burning past their usual hours? Which sections of the palace had fallen suspiciously quiet? The portraits themselves told the story of Byzantine succession, a bloody catalogue of emperors who had died in bed, emperors who had died in battle, and emperors who had simply died under mysterious circumstances that nobody discussed in polite company. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her movement as if the ghosts of previous rulers were trying to warn her about something she couldn't yet see. But it wasn't the dead emperors that worried her tonight. It was the living courtiers who had learned their lessons too well. In this environment, trust wasn't just dangerous, it was impossible. Every friendship was a potential betrayal waiting for the right price. Every confidence was a weapon that could be turned against you when circumstances changed. The genius of the Byzantine system was that it forced everyone to become psychologists. Survival required reading micro-expressions, interpreting voice tones, and analyzing behavioral patterns with the precision of a physician diagnosing disease. A raised eyebrow could indicate doubt. A pause before speaking might suggest deception. The way someone held their wine cup could signal their allegiance to a particular faction. Theodora had mastered these skills through necessity, but she was beginning to suspect that others had been studying her with the same intensity. Tonight's dinner had felt like an examination, with her unknowingly playing the role of the specimen being analyzed. They had been watching her reactions, measuring her responses, gathering data about her psychological state. The most unsettling realization was that this level of sophisticated observation required time, patience, and resources that suggested coordination among people she had considered separate entities. Her enemies weren't just individual ambitious courtiers anymore. They had somehow evolved into something more dangerous, a network that shared information and coordinated strategy. As she finally reached her private chambers, Theodora caught sight of her reflection in the polished bronze mirror beside her door. The woman looking back had the face of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. The gap between those two realities was where fear lived. Her personal servant was waiting inside, but something about his posture seemed different tonight, more attentive, more careful, as if he too was playing a role that required unusual precision. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quality she had noticed in others throughout the evening, the sound of someone choosing words with surgical care. "Will your Majesty require anything else this evening?" It was a simple question, the same one he asked every night, but tonight it felt like a test, as if her answer would be reported to someone else and analyzed for hidden meaning. In this world of marble and malice, even the most innocent interactions had become dangerous, and in this maze of calculated suspicion and engineered mistrust, one woman had learned to play the game better than anyone. But even she was beginning to wonder if she had finally encountered opponents who understood the rules as well as she did. 25 years before that fateful dinner, a girl named Theodora had learned her first lesson about survival in the Hippodrome of Constantinople. She was barely 15, standing half naked in the arena, while 50,000 spectators screamed for blood and spectacle. But what they didn't know was that the real performance wasn't happening on the sand. It was happening inside her mind, where she was cataloguing every face, every reaction, every weakness she could exploit. The transition from courtesan to empress wasn't magic, it was mathematics. Cold, brutal calculations about human nature, performed by someone who had been forced to understand the price of everything and the value of nothing. While noble children played with toys, Theodora had been learning to read the desires that men thought they kept hidden. While palace-born ladies practiced embroidery, she was mastering the art of making powerful people need her more than she needed them. Her mother had been a bearkeeper's assistant, her father a charioteer who died when she was 7. In most societies this would have meant a life of grinding poverty and early death. But Constantinople was different. Constantinople was a machine that transformed desperation into opportunity, provided you were smart enough to understand how the gears turned, and ruthless enough to insert yourself between them. The brothels had been her university, the theatres had been her laboratory. Every night brought new lessons in human psychology, taught by men who paid for the privilege of revealing their deepest vulnerabilities. She learned that senators who thundered about virtue in the forum would weep like children when confronted with their own mortality, that generals who commanded armies with iron discipline became helpless puppets when their sexual appetites were properly manipulated, that even bishops, those supposed servants of eternal truth, would compromise any principle for the right combination of pleasure and discretion. But the most important lesson had nothing to do with sex. It was about information. In a world where knowledge was power, she had access to secrets that could topple governments, not because men told her these things deliberately, but because they forgot that the woman in their bed had a mind capable of connecting dots they didn't even know they were drawing. The night she met Justinian, she was performing in a production that would have scandalized Christians if they had understood the philosophical implications. But Justinian wasn't watching her body, he was watching her eyes, while other men in the audience focused on her physical performance. The future emperor was studying her intelligence. He saw something that others missed, a mind that had been sharpened by necessity into a weapon more dangerous than any sword. Their courtship had been a masterclass in strategic deception. She played the role of the reformed sinner, seeking redemption, while he convinced himself that he was saving a fallen woman through the power of pure love. The reality was more complex, and far more interesting. They were both performers, each giving the other exactly what they needed to justify what they wanted. He needed to believe he was noble. She needed to survive long enough to accumulate real power. The transformation from Theodora, the actress, to Theodora the Empress had required her to become someone else entirely, but without losing the skills that had kept her alive. She learned to speak like nobility while thinking like someone who had grown up in the streets. She mastered court etiquette while maintaining the psychological instincts of someone who had been forced to read people's intentions or die. The isolation of absolute power was something she had never anticipated. In the brothels, at least she had been part of a community of survivors. They looked out for each other because they understood that their enemies were external and obvious. But in the palace, everyone was both ally and threat simultaneously. The woman who braided your hair in the morning might be the one who whispered poison in your husband's ear by evening. What made her dangerous wasn't cruelty, it was empathy. She understood human motivation with a precision that frightened people who were used to hiding their true intentions. When senators plotted against her, she could predict their moves, not because she was smarter than them, but because she understood the psychology of ambition better than men who had never been forced to fight for survival. The religious establishment had been her greatest challenge. They saw her past as an actress and courtesan as evidence of moral corruption, but they misunderstood what those experiences had actually taught her. While they had spent their lives studying theoretical ethics, she had learned practical psychology. While they debated the nature of sin in abstract terms, she had observed how human beings actually behaved when they thought nobody was watching. Her influence over Justinian wasn't based on sexual manipulation, though her enemies preferred that explanation because it was simpler than the truth. The truth was that she had become the only person in his life who could tell him what he needed to hear instead of what he wanted to hear. In a world full of sycophants and flatterers, she offered something more valuable than agreement. She offered accurate information about reality. The Nika riots had been her moment of ultimate validation. While the emperor and his advisors panicked at the sight of the city burning, while they prepared to flee like cowards, she had stood in the throne room and delivered the speech that saved the empire, not because she was braver than the men around her, but because she understood something they didn't. Sometimes survival requires the willingness to risk everything. Purple makes a fine shroud, she had told them, referring to the imperial color that symbolized ultimate power. The message was simple: better to die as an empress than live as a refugee. But the deeper meaning was more complex. She was telling them that retreat wasn't actually an option, because retreat would only delay their destruction, not prevent it. The speech had worked because it appealed to their self-interest while disguising itself as noble sentiment. She convinced them to stay and fight, not by appealing to their courage, but by making them understand that cowardice was actually the more dangerous choice. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, performed by someone who had learned to read human nature in the cruelest school imaginable. But even Theodora couldn't see the trap that was slowly closing around her. Success had given her confidence, but confidence could become blindness. Power had surrounded her with people who needed her approval, but need could transform into resentment when circumstances changed. The skills that had carried her from the gutter to the throne were the same skills that might ultimately destroy her, because they had made her too dangerous for others to ignore. The great palace had been designed by madmen who understood sanity better than the sane ever could. Walking through its corridors was like navigating the physical manifestation of a fevered mind. Beautiful, logical, and completely insane all at the same time. Every surface had been crafted to serve two purposes: to demonstrate the power of the empire, and to drive its inhabitants slowly, systematically mad with the constant awareness that they were being watched. The walls breathed with hidden listeners, not metaphorically, literally. The architects had embedded acoustic chambers behind the marble facades, creating spaces where human beings could crouch in darkness for hours, collecting conversations like spiders collecting flies. These listeners weren't servants or guards. They were specialists, trained from childhood to distinguish between meaningful information and casual chatter, to remember exact phrases and identify voices in complete darkness. The mirror system was even more sophisticated. Polished bronze and silver had been positioned at mathematically precise angles throughout the complex, creating sight lines that seemed impossible. A person sitting in the Eastern Library could observe conversations happening in the Western Chapel, provided they knew which reflective surface to watch and how to interpret what they saw. The effect was that privacy became an illusion. You might think you were alone, but you were never certain. But the true genius wasn't in the surveillance itself. It was in making sure that everyone knew surveillance was possible, without knowing exactly how it worked. Uncertainty was more powerful than certainty, because it forced people to modify their behavior constantly. You couldn't relax even when you were genuinely alone, because you could never be completely sure that you actually were alone. The room layouts had been engineered to create psychological pressure through spatial relationships, Certain chambers were designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant, with ceilings that soared beyond the reach of lamplight and walls that seemed to stretch into infinity. Other spaces felt claustrophobic despite their actual size, using optical illusions and strategic lighting to create the sensation of being trapped. The famous Room of Whispers in the Eastern Wing represented the pinnacle of Byzantine psychological warfare through architecture. The chamber appeared to be a simple circular meeting space, decorated with mosaics depicting scenes of imperial triumph, but the acoustics had been engineered with mathematical precision. A person standing at the center could hear conversations happening anywhere along the walls, while those same conversations were inaudible to people standing just a few feet away from the speakers. Even more disturbing was how the room affected the speakers themselves. Something about the acoustic properties made people feel compelled to whisper, even when they intended to speak normally. The result was that anyone who entered the space automatically began behaving like a conspirator, regardless of their actual intentions. The room literally manufactured the appearance of guilt. The flooring told its own story of calculated madness. Marble patterns that appeared random actually contained coded messages, readable by those who understood the symbolic system. A visitor's path through a room could spell out words, indicate allegiances, or signal intentions simply through their choice of where to step. The most skilled court politicians could conduct entire conversations without speaking, using only their movement through strategically designed spaces. Color had been weaponized as well. Certain shades of purple were reserved for the imperial family, but the gradations were so subtle that violating the dress code might be accidental, or might be a deliberate test of the emperor's attention to detail. Gold appeared throughout the palace in dozens of different alloys and applications, each with its own significance in the hierarchy of court protocol. Wearing the wrong shade of gold to the wrong event could be interpreted as either ignorance or insurrection. The lighting system created its own form of psychological manipulation. Oil lamps and candles were positioned to cast shadows that seemed to move independently, creating the constant sense that figures were lurking just beyond the edge of vision. Mirrors caught and reflected flame in ways that made the light itself seem alive, dancing and shifting in patterns that suggested hidden meanings. But perhaps the most sophisticated element was the way the architecture enforced isolation while creating the illusion of community. Grand halls brought hundreds of people together, while ensuring that private conversation was nearly impossible. Smaller chambers provided intimacy while making certain that intimate conversations could be overheard by hidden listeners. The result was that everyone felt simultaneously crowded and alone, connected and isolated, part of a community and completely vulnerable. The servants' passages were as complex as the public spaces, creating a parallel universe where information traveled through a network of people who were simultaneously invisible and all-seeing. These passages allowed access to every room in the complex, but they also created choke points where conversations could be monitored and movements could be tracked. The people who used these passages became part of the surveillance system whether they wanted to or not. Even the gardens weren't safe spaces. Topiary had been sculpted to create acoustic amplification, turning casual outdoor conversations into performances that could be heard from surprising distances. Fountains provided covering noise, but their positioning created dead spots where whispered conversations became crystal clear to listeners positioned in specific locations. The cumulative effect was that everyone who lived or worked in the palace became a participant in a vast psychological experiment. They were simultaneously the subjects being studied and the researchers collecting data. Trust became impossible, not because people were inherently untrustworthy, but because the environment made trustworthy behavior literally impossible to verify. In this environment, trust wasn't just dangerous, it was impossible. Every conversation might be overheard, every gesture might be misinterpreted, every friendship might be a performance designed to extract information or establish leverage. The palace didn't just house the government of the Byzantine Empire, it was a machine designed to transform human beings into the raw materials of political intelligence. And in this maze of engineered madness, the difference between paranoia and intelligence had become meaningless. The people who survived weren't the ones who trusted too little or too much. They were the ones who understood that the architecture itself was their greatest enemy. Antonina had learned the rules of palace warfare from the most dangerous teacher imaginable, necessity, while other women of her station concerned themselves with fashion and gossip. She had been forced to become a student of power dynamics because her husband's military genius had made him simultaneously invaluable and expendable. In the Byzantine Empire, being too successful was often more dangerous than being incompetent. General Belisarius commanded armies with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a butcher. He had reconquered North Africa, humiliated the Goths in Italy, and stood as the living symbol of imperial military power. But every victory had made him more dangerous to the people who ruled from the comfort of marble palaces, while he bled in foreign mud. Antonina understood what her husband was too honorable to see, that his success was signing his death warrant one triumph at a time. The court ladies had initially dismissed her as a provincial nobody, the wife of a soldier who lacked the refined brutality of palace-born aristocrats. They saw her directness as crudeness, her loyalty as simplicity, and her intelligence as something quaint and rustic. This had been their mistake. While they played their elaborate games of social positioning, she had been studying them with the focused intensity of someone whose family's survival depended on reading the political weather. Her campaign against Theodora hadn't begun as conscious strategy. It had started as pure survival instinct when she realized that the Empress saw Belisarius as a potential threat to be managed rather than an asset to be treasured. The general's wife had watched other military heroes receive imperial gratitude, which in Byzantine terms meant forced retirement, comfortable exile, or mysterious deaths that nobody investigated too closely. The weapons available to palace ladies were subtle, but devastatingly effective. Seating arrangements at formal dinners could indicate favor or disfavor in ways that everyone understood but nobody could openly challenge. The choice of which events to attend and which to avoid sent messages throughout the court about shifting allegiances. Even something as simple as the timing of a compliment could be interpreted as either support or mockery, depending on who was listening and what they needed to hear. Antonina had become a master of this silent language. When she wore certain colors to specific events, she was signaling her position on issues that were never directly discussed. When she chose to sit near particular people, she was advertising alliances that existed only in the shared understanding of the observers. When she timed her arrivals and departures, she was conducting conversations without words about topics that were too dangerous to mention aloud. The most sophisticated element of her strategy was how she used other people's assumptions against them. The court expected military wives to be straightforward and politically naive, so she let them see exactly what they expected while conducting much more complex operations beneath the surface of their awareness. Her apparent simplicity became a form of camouflage that allowed her to move through palace society without triggering the defensive instincts of more obviously dangerous players. Her relationship with other military wives had become a network of shared intelligence and mutual protection. These women understood stakes that palace-born aristocrats could only imagine. Their husbands fought real battles against actual enemies, which gave them a perspective on risk and consequence that made court intrigue seem like children's games. But they also understood that political battles could be just as deadly as military ones, and considerably more personal. The coordination required for effective palace warfare was almost military in its precision. Information had to be gathered, analyzed, and distributed through channels that couldn't be monitored by hostile forces. Plans had to be made that could adapt to changing circumstances without falling apart entirely. Most importantly, everyone involved had to maintain their cover identities while working toward goals that couldn't be openly discussed. Antonina's greatest advantage was that nobody expected her to be capable of long-term strategic thinking. Military wives were supposed to be concerned with immediate, practical matters: their husband's safety, their children's futures, their household's management. The idea that she might be conducting a sophisticated campaign to neutralize the empire's most powerful woman was literally inconceivable to people who had grown up believing that intelligence was somehow connected to social position. But her greatest disadvantage was that she was fighting on enemy territory, according to rules that her opponents had spent their entire lives mastering. Every move she made was being observed and analyzed by people who understood the game better than she did. Every alliance she formed was potentially vulnerable to countermoves that she might not see coming. Every success made her more visible to enemies who preferred to operate in shadows. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity to her situation. Theodora's theological positions weren't just matters of spiritual conviction. They were political weapons disguised as pious beliefs. By taking different positions on religious questions, palace factions could express hostility while maintaining the appearance of scholarly debate. Antonina had been forced to become a theologian not because she cared about doctrine, but because doctrinal disputes were how palace politics were conducted in public. Her husband remained blissfully unaware of the war being fought on his behalf. Belisarius understood military strategy with brilliant clarity, but he was psychologically incapable of grasping the Byzantine approach to conflict. He saw enemies and allies as distinct categories, battles as discrete events with clear outcomes, and loyalty as a simple concept with obvious applications. The idea that his closest friends might be simultaneously working for his destruction was literally incomprehensible to his military mind. This innocence was both touching and dangerous. It meant that Antonina was fighting a war where her most important ally was also her greatest vulnerability. Every move she made to protect him could potentially expose him to new forms of attack. Every enemy she neutralized might be replaced by someone more dangerous. Every victory might trigger responses that she couldn't predict or counter. What Antonina didn't realize was that Theodora had been reading her signals all along. The empress who had learned to decode human intention in the brothels and theatres of Constantinople was more than capable of understanding the political communications of a general's wife. Every subtle message had been intercepted. Every careful alliance had been noted. Every strategic move had been anticipated and countered before it could achieve its intended effect. The war between the two women had been fought entirely in the language of palace protocol, but it was about to become something much more direct and considerably more dangerous. Information moved through the Byzantine palace like water through stone, slowly, invisibly, and with the power to crack foundations when it finally reached its destination. The official channels of communication were elaborate performances designed to waste time and obscure meaning, but the real business of empire was conducted through a parallel system that existed in plain sight while remaining completely hidden. Jewelry had become a language more precise than Greek or Latin. The choice of which gems to wear, how many rings to display, and which brooches to pin, where could communicate complex political positions to anyone who understood the code. A sapphire worn on the left hand might indicate support for a particular military campaign. An emerald positioned above the heart could signal religious allegiance. Even the absence of expected ornamentation sent messages, sometimes the most important ones. Theodora had pioneered the use of pearl arrangements as a form of encrypted correspondence. The patterns in which pearls were sewn onto garments could spell out words, indicate dates, or reference shared memories that served as authentication codes. A dress that appeared to be simply elegant to casual observers might actually be delivering detailed intelligence to someone who knew how to read the arrangement of decorative elements. The palace florists had become unwitting participants in an intelligence network that spanned the empire. Flower arrangements weren't just aesthetic choices, they were tactical communications. Roses indicated urgency, lilies suggested caution. The combination of specific blooms could indicate meeting times, locations, or even the identities of people who shouldn't be trusted. The most sophisticated operators could conduct entire conversations through their choice of table decorations. Religious manuscripts served as perfect cover for more secular forms of communication. Scribes who appeared to be copying theological texts were actually embedding coded messages in their illuminated letters and decorative borders. A carefully positioned flourish might indicate that a particular person had changed their allegiance. An angel's wing drawn at an unusual angle could specify a time and place for a clandestine meeting. The sacred and the profane had become indistinguishable in the hands of truly skilled political operators. The palace architecture itself had been turned into a messaging system. Certain combinations of which doors were left open, which windows had their curtains drawn, and which corridors were lit at unusual hours, could communicate complex information to observers who knew what to look for. The building had become a massive three-dimensional telegraph system, constantly broadcasting intelligence to anyone who could decode its signals. Even the servants had been incorporated into this communication network, though most of them remained unaware of their role. The order in which rooms were cleaned, the timing of meal service, and the routes taken through the palace, all carried meaning to people who understood the system. A slightly delayed dinner might indicate that security had been compromised. A carpet cleaned at an unusual time could signal that a particular room was no longer safe for sensitive conversation. The most elegant aspect of this system was how it turned normal palace life into a form of steganography, the art of hiding messages in plain sight. Every routine activity became a potential carrier for intelligence. Every ordinary interaction might conceal extraordinary significance. The result was that the palace functioned as a vast living encryption device, constantly generating and transmitting coded information through channels that appeared completely innocent. Music had evolved into perhaps the most sophisticated element of the communication system. Court musicians weren't just entertainers. They were intelligence operatives who could embed messages in their performances. A particular melody played at a specific tempo might indicate that a coup was being planned. The choice of which instruments to feature could identify the people involved. Even the timing of applause could serve as a form of responsive communication, allowing audience members to acknowledge receipt of musical messages. The dining protocols had become a form of three-dimensional chess, where every move carried multiple meanings, where people sat, what they ate, how they held their utensils, and when they spoke all contributed to an ongoing conversation that happened entirely through behavioral signals. A guest who chose fish over meat might be indicating their position on a theological dispute. Someone who ate quickly could be signaling urgency about a military matter. The pace of conversation, the topics discussed, and even the volume of laughter all conveyed information to people who had learned to read the social dynamics as a form of text. But the most sophisticated operators had learned to layer multiple communication systems simultaneously. A single evening at court might involve exchanging information through jewelry codes, flower arrangements, musical performances, seating protocols, and conversational innuendo all at the same time. The result was a communication environment so rich and complex that it required intense concentration just to follow a single thread of meaning through the maze of intersecting signals. The genius of this system was that it provided perfect deniability. If someone was accused of sending treasonous messages, they could always claim that their jewelry choices were purely aesthetic, their flower preferences were matters of personal taste, and their seating arrangements were random courtesy. The messages existed only in the minds of people who chose to interpret them as meaningful, which made prosecution almost impossible and detection extremely difficult. This had created an environment where everyone was simultaneously a code breaker and a code maker, constantly encrypting their own communications while trying to decrypt everyone else's. The cognitive load was enormous, but it had become as natural as breathing for people who had grown up in this environment. They thought in multiple layers of meaning simultaneously, crafting sentences that said one thing to casual listeners while conveying entirely different information to people who possessed the proper decryption keys. The psychological effect was to make paranoia not just reasonable, but necessary. In an environment where every gesture might be significant and every coincidence might be intentional, the ability to see patterns and connections became essential for survival. People who couldn't decode the hidden messages were excluded from the real conversations, which meant they were excluded from real power. But someone had learned to intercept these silent conversations. Someone had cracked the codes, identified the patterns, and figured out how to monitor communications that were supposed to be undetectable. The question wasn't just who had this capability, it was how long they had been using it, and what they planned to do with the intelligence they had gathered. Narses moved through the palace with the calculated grace of someone who had learned to make powerlessness into the ultimate form of power. As chief eunuch, he occupied a position that was simultaneously degraded and elevated, dismissed and feared, pitied and envied. He was living proof that in Byzantine politics, the people who appeared weakest were often the ones who posed the greatest danger. His castration had been performed when he was 12, not as punishment but as preparation for a career that required absolute trust from people who trusted no one. Eunuchs couldn't found dynasties, which made them safe confidants for emperors who saw potential usurpers in every son-in-law and nephew. But this apparent limitation had become Narses's greatest strength. He had nothing to lose in the traditional sense, which made him capable of risks that would have terrified men with families to protect. The network he had built over 30 years of palace service was more comprehensive than the official intelligence apparatus of the empire. His agents weren't professional spies, they were gardeners and seamstresses, musicians and scribes, cooks and cleaning women who had learned that survival meant keeping their eyes open and their mouths shut until the right person asked the right questions. Most of them didn't even realize they were part of an intelligence operation. They simply understood that Narses paid well for interesting information and asked very few uncomfortable questions about how that information was obtained. His physical appearance had become a form of camouflage. Palace visitors saw a middle-aged eunuch with soft features and gentle mannerisms, someone who posed no threat and commanded no particular respect. This invisibility allowed him to move through spaces where more obviously powerful people would have been noticed and remembered. He could attend meetings where his presence was forgotten, overhear conversations where his existence was ignored, and observe interactions where his intelligence was underestimated. But the most dangerous aspect of Narcissus wasn't his intelligence network. It was his psychological insight into the dynamics of power in a society that had made him simultaneously essential and excluded. He understood ambition from the perspective of someone who could never satisfy his own, which gave him a unique ability to predict how other people would behave when their desires conflicted with their limitations. He had become an expert in the psychology of frustration, compensation, and the specific forms of madness that power creates in people who aren't equipped to handle it responsibly. His relationship with Theodora was the most complex element in a career built on complex relationships. She was the only person in the palace who had risen from genuinely humble origins, which created a form of understanding between them that didn't exist in his interactions with anyone else. But she was also the person most capable of threatening his position, because she understood the sources of his power better than people who had been born into privilege. They circled each other like dancers who knew the steps but weren't certain about the music. The eunuch system had created a parallel hierarchy within the palace that operated according to different rules from the official power structure. Eunuchs couldn't inherit titles or accumulate wealth in the traditional ways, but they could accumulate influence, information, and the specific form of respect that came from being indispensable to people who officially outranked them. Narcissus had become the unofficial coordinator of this shadow system, which gave him access to resources that even the emperor didn't fully understand. His greatest achievement had been learning to make other people's secrets into his own form of capital. He collected information not to use it as blackmail, that would have been crude and ultimately self-defeating, but to use it as a form of currency in transactions where traditional money was meaningless. A senator's gambling debts might be worth a general's military plans. A bishop's sexual indiscretions could be traded for a merchant's commercial intelligence. The result was that he had become a central clearinghouse for information that people needed, but couldn't obtain through official channels. The religious establishments throughout the empire had become an essential part of his intelligence apparatus. Monasteries and convents were natural gathering points for information, because they attracted people from all levels of society who needed spiritual guidance, practical assistance, or simply safe places to hide when political situations became dangerous. The monks and nuns who provided these services learned things that they were sworn not to repeat. But Narcissus had discovered that religious vows created interesting philosophical questions about what constituted repetition versus sharing information for the greater good of the empire. His financial operations were as sophisticated as his intelligence work. Eunuchs were legally prohibited from many forms of property ownership, but they weren't prohibited from serving as agents, advisors, and intermediaries for other people's transactions. Over the decades, Narcissus had positioned himself as the invisible partner in commercial enterprises throughout the Mediterranean. He didn't own ships, but he arranged their cargo. He didn't control trade routes, but he influenced the people who did. The result was a form of economic power that was completely legal and almost completely hidden. But perhaps his most valuable asset was his ability to serve as a neutral party in disputes between people who couldn't trust each other directly. In a world where every negotiation carried the risk of betrayal, Narcissus had established himself as someone who could be trusted to honor agreements even when honoring them wasn't in his immediate interest. This reputation had made him essential to people who needed to conduct business, but couldn't afford to meet in person or communicate through channels that might be monitored. The psychological toll of his position was something he had learned to manage rather than overcome. Living as a permanent outsider in a society that needed his services, but would never fully accept his humanity, required a form of emotional discipline that bordered on the pathological. He had become expert at maintaining relationships that were simultaneously intimate and distant, essential and dispensable, trusting and paranoid. His understanding of palace dynamics had reached a level of sophistication that sometimes frightened even him. He could predict alliance shifts weeks before they became obvious to the participants. He could identify potential coups in their earliest stages, by recognizing patterns of behavior that indicated coordination between people who were supposed to be rivals. Most disturbingly, he had learned to manipulate these dynamics by introducing carefully chosen pieces of information at precisely the right moments, creating chain reactions that served his purposes while appearing completely natural to everyone involved. In a world of fathers and sons, the man with no heirs held all the cards. But even Narcissus was beginning to sense that the game was changing in ways that his experience hadn't prepared him for. The traditional rules of palace politics were being abandoned by people who had decided that the risks of conventional behavior now outweighed the benefits of predictable outcomes. Someone was building a network that operated according to different principles from the ones he understood, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't certain that his position as the ultimate insider would be sufficient to protect him from forces that he could sense, but couldn't yet identify. The crown of the Byzantine Empire weighed 14 pounds of gold and precious stones, but it was the invisible weight that was killing Justinian slowly, one decision at a time. Every morning he woke to reports of barbarian invasions, plague outbreaks, religious heresies, and palace conspiracies that required his immediate attention and perfect judgment. Every evening he went to sleep knowing that his choices had created new enemies, while failing to satisfy the people who were supposed to be his allies. Being emperor meant existing in a state of perpetual contradiction. He was the most powerful man in the known world, but he couldn't trust anyone around him. He commanded absolute obedience, but he couldn't be certain that his orders were being carried out as intended. He was surrounded by people whose entire careers depended on pleasing him, but he couldn't believe anything they told him because their survival required them to lie professionally. The relationship with his wife had become the most complex element in a life built on impossible complexity. Theodora was simultaneously his greatest asset and his greatest liability, his most trusted advisor, and the person most likely to drag him into conflicts he couldn't win. She understood palace politics with a precision that amazed him, but her understanding came from experiences that other people considered disqualifying for an empress. Every time she provided brilliant counsel, she also reminded the court that their emperor had married a former prostitute. His private correspondence reveals a man tortured by questions that had no satisfactory answers. Should he trust the military commanders who had won great victories but might be planning to win the ultimate victory over him? Should he believe the religious advisors who assured him that God supported his policies while clearly maneuvering for their own advancement? Should he rely on the senators who publicly praised his wisdom while privately questioning every decision he made? The emperor's daily schedule was a masterpiece of strategic impossibility. He had to appear accessible enough to maintain his connection with the people, but protected enough to prevent assassination. He needed to seem decisive enough to command respect, but consultative enough to avoid appearing tyrannical. He was required to be both visionary leader and practical administrator, both military commander and religious authority, both public symbol and private human being. The information that reached him had been filtered through so many layers of interpretation and agenda that it bore only a coincidental resemblance to actual reality. Military reports emphasized victories while minimizing defeats. Economic advisors presented statistics that supported whatever policies they had already decided to recommend. Religious authorities explained theological disputes in ways that made their own positions seem obviously correct, while making their opponents appear dangerous to imperial authority. His attempts to get unfiltered information had created their own problems. When he tried to bypass official channels by gathering intelligence through informal networks, he was accused of being paranoid and undermining the people who were supposed to serve him. When he relied on official reports, he was criticized for being naive and out of touch with what was really happening in his empire. The solution to too little information was to gather more information, but the solution to too much information was somehow also to gather more information, because the real challenge was distinguishing between accurate and inaccurate intelligence. The theological controversies were perhaps the most exhausting aspect of his position, because they combined the highest possible stakes with the most abstract possible subject matter. The monophysite dispute wasn't just about the nature of Christ, it was about the loyalty of entire provinces, the unity of the empire, and the emperor's relationship with the religious authorities who controlled significant independent resources. But understanding the political implications required mastering theological subtleties that would have challenged professional scholars, while making decisions quickly enough to prevent religious disagreements from becoming military conflicts. His relationship with the Senate represented everything that was frustrating about being emperor in a system that still pretended to respect republican traditions. The senators had to be consulted about major decisions, but their advice was worthless because they had no real responsibility for implementing policies or dealing with their consequences. They could afford to hold idealistic positions because they would never be held accountable for the practical results of those positions. Meanwhile, he had to make choices that balanced ideal outcomes against realistic constraints, then defend those choices to people who didn't understand why compromises were necessary. The military situation required him to think simultaneously as strategist, logistician, diplomat, and accountant. Every campaign was a massive financial investment, that might or might not produce returns sufficient to justify the costs. Every victory expanded the empire's borders while stretching its resources thinner. Every defeat not only lost territory, but also encouraged other enemies to test the empire's remaining strength. He had to appear confident about military policies while knowing that warfare had become so complex and expensive that even successful campaigns might ultimately weaken the empire they were designed to protect. But the most psychologically difficult aspect of being emperor was the isolation that came from being the final decision-maker in a system where all decisions had consequences that couldn't be fully predicted or controlled. He was surrounded by advisors, but he was ultimately alone with his choices. He could consult experts, but he couldn't transfer responsibility to them. He could delegate authority, but he couldn't delegate the burden of knowing that every major decision might trigger chain reactions that would reshape the Mediterranean world in ways that no one could anticipate. His private letters to distant relatives reveal a man who understood that his position was simultaneously too powerful and not powerful enough. He had the authority to order the deaths of thousands of people, but he couldn't ensure that his orders were carried out competently. He could declare wars, but he couldn't guarantee that those wars would be fought intelligently. He could promote people to positions of authority, but he couldn't make them worthy of the trust he was forced to place in them. The plague had made all of these problems worse by introducing an element of pure randomness into a political system that depended on predictability. Death was striking down loyal supporters and dangerous enemies with equal indifference, reshuffling the balance of power in ways that no one could plan for or control. The emperor, who was supposed to be able to solve any problem, was faced with a problem that couldn't be solved by any human agency. His choice would echo through history in ways he never imagined, but at the time it felt like just another impossible decision in a career built on impossible decisions. The difference was that this time, the choice wasn't between good and bad options. It was between different forms of catastrophe, and the consequences would extend far beyond his own survival to determine the future of everything he had tried to build. The Chapel of St. Stephen had been built for contemplation, but on this particular midnight in 54 AD, it was serving as headquarters for something that would have shocked the saint himself. In the flickering candlelight, 3 men knelt in prayer while conducting treason, their whispered Latin prayers providing cover for Greek conspiracies that had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with earthly power. Bishop Vigilius had travelled from Rome with papal authority to resolve the 3 chapters controversy, but he had discovered that theological disputes in Constantinople were like mathematical equations, where the variables kept changing according to political calculations. What began as scholarly disagreements about ancient church fathers had evolved into something far more dangerous, a weapon system that could destroy empires while maintaining the appearance of pious devotion to doctrinal purity. The monophysite question was the perfect cover for conspiracy because it was simultaneously incomprehensible to most people and absolutely essential to everyone's political survival. The theological issue whether Christ had one nature or two seemed abstract enough to be harmless, but the political implications were concrete enough to start civil wars. Entire provinces had declared their loyalty based on interpretations of Greek philosophy that 90% of the population couldn't understand and didn't care about. Theodora's support for monophysite positions wasn't driven by spiritual conviction. It was strategic brilliance disguised as religious enthusiasm. By positioning herself as the protector of theologians who believed in Christ's single divine nature, she had gained the loyalty of Egypt, Syria, and other eastern provinces that generated massive tax revenues while providing military recruits. Her opponents could attack her theological positions, but they couldn't attack her political base without appearing to oppose the financial foundation of the empire. The Western bishops had initially seen this as an opportunity to reduce her influence by forcing her to choose between theological correctness and political advantage. They assumed that she would eventually compromise her religious positions to maintain her secular power, which would discredit her with the eastern provinces while proving that her piety was fraudulent. This was their first mistake. They had underestimated someone who had learned to turn every apparent weakness into a strategic advantage. The conspiracy that was forming in St. Stephen's Chapel was more sophisticated than simple theological opposition. The participants had realized that religious authority could be used to legitimize political actions that would otherwise be recognized as treasonous. By framing their opposition to Theodora in doctrinal terms, they could claim to be defending the faith rather than pursuing personal advancement. By recruiting allies among the Eastern bishops, they could make their attack appear to be a spiritual movement rather than a palace coup. But they had made a crucial error in their understanding of how religious politics actually worked in the Byzantine system. They assumed that theological arguments were tools that could be picked up and used when convenient, then set aside when no longer needed. They didn't understand that in Theodora's hands, religious doctrine had become something more dangerous than a weapon. It had become a form of identity that created unbreakable bonds between her and millions of people who had never seen Constantinople, but who would die before accepting that their empress was a heretic. The 3 chapters controversy provided the perfect mechanism for their plans, because it involved ancient theological disputes that could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on political necessity. They could argue that defending the orthodox position required removing imperial officials who supported heretical teachings. They could claim that protecting the faith demanded extraordinary measures against people who threatened the spiritual unity of the empire. Most importantly, they could present assassination as martyrdom and treason as religious duty. Their network extended far beyond Constantinople, reaching into monasteries and cathedral cities throughout the empire. Monks who had taken vows of poverty were secretly financing political operations. Abbots who preached obedience to earthly authority were coordinating resistance to imperial policies. The same religious infrastructure that was supposed to support imperial legitimacy was being turned into a weapon against the people who controlled that infrastructure. The genius of their approach was that it turned Theodora's greatest strength into her greatest vulnerability. Her theological positions had given her enormous political power, but they had also made her dependent on maintaining doctrinal consistency. Any compromise on religious questions would be seen as betrayal by her Eastern supporters, but refusing to compromise would be interpreted as defiance by her Western opponents. They had created a situation where she couldn't win by being flexible, and couldn't win by being rigid. The financial dimensions of the religious conspiracy were as sophisticated as the theological elements. Church properties throughout the empire were being used to move money and resources in ways that bypassed imperial taxation and oversight. Monasteries were serving as banks, pilgrimage routes were functioning as trade networks, and religious ceremonies were providing cover for meetings that had nothing to do with spiritual matters. The same system that collected donations for charity was funding operations designed to overthrow the people who protected the donors. But the most dangerous aspect of their plan was how it used religious authority to legitimize actions that would normally be recognized as criminal. Murder could be presented as defending the faith. Theft could be justified as recovering resources that had been misappropriated by heretics. Rebellion could be transformed into righteous resistance to ungodly authority. They had found a way to make treason appear virtuous while making loyalty appear sinful. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. By questioning Theodora's theological positions, they were attacking her personal identity in ways that political opposition never could. She wasn't just being criticized for her policies, she was being condemned for her soul. The attacks were designed to create doubt, not just about her political judgment, but about her fundamental worth as a human being. In a society where religious authority was considered more important than earthly power, this was the most devastating form of assault possible. Their mistake was assuming that someone who had survived brothels and bear pits would be vulnerable to theological intimidation. They had forgotten that Theodora's religious convictions weren't academic abstractions. They were survival tools that she had learned to use with the same deadly precision that had carried her from the streets to the throne. What they called heresy was actually the most sophisticated political strategy ever devised, and they were about to discover that their theological weapons were no match for someone who understood the real relationship between faith and power. The midnight meetings in St. Stephen's Chapel weren't just planning sessions. They were religious services where the participants were worshipping their own ambitions while convincing themselves that they were serving God. But in the Byzantine Empire, the difference between serving God and serving the emperor had been deliberately obscured for so long that even the conspirators had lost track of which master they were actually trying to please. Death arrived in Constantinople on a grain ship from Alexandria, hidden among the wheat that was supposed to feed the empire. The sailors who unloaded the cargo didn't notice the rats that scurried into the city's warehouses, and the rats didn't announce that they carried passengers smaller than fleas, but more powerful than armies. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the Justinian plague had begun reshaping the Mediterranean world in ways that no human intelligence could have predicted or controlled. The disease was democratic in ways that palace politics had never been. It killed senators and slaves with equal enthusiasm, showed no respect for theological positions, and demonstrated a complete indifference to the conspiracies that had seemed so important just weeks before. In the space of a month, Constantinople transformed from a city obsessed with subtle power games into a charnel house where the only relevant skill was the ability to dispose of corpses faster than they accumulated. Theodora's response to the crisis revealed aspects of her character that even her closest allies hadn't suspected. While other palace officials fled to country estates or barricaded themselves behind walls of supposed immunity, she remained in the city and personally organized relief efforts that saved thousands of lives. But her motivations weren't entirely humanitarian. She understood that crisis creates opportunity for those who are willing to take risks while others are paralyzed by fear. The plague struck hardest in the overcrowded districts where her earliest supporters lived, but it also devastated the ranks of her enemies with surgical precision. Several key conspirators died within days of each other, their deaths appearing to be random casualties of an unstoppable epidemic. The timing was so convenient that some people whispered about divine intervention on the Empress's behalf, though others suggested that the gods of coincidence had received mortal assistance from someone who understood how diseases spread through predictable patterns. Emperor Justinian fell ill in the epidemic's third month, and for 6 weeks the empire teetered on the edge of civil war, while he drifted between consciousness and death. During this period, Theodora effectively ruled alone, making decisions that would have been controversial even in normal circumstances. She negotiated directly with military commanders, reallocated imperial resources, and issued orders that bypassed traditional administrative channels. When her husband recovered, he discovered that his wife had used his near-death experience to consolidate power in ways that made her indispensable to the empire's continued functioning. The economic impact was as dramatic as the political consequences. Trade routes that had operated for centuries were disrupted when entire port cities became uninhabitable. Agricultural production collapsed in regions where the farming population died or fled. The tax revenues that funded the empire's military and administrative operations simply disappeared, forcing immediate decisions about which expenses were essential and which could be abandoned. In this environment, anyone who could maintain basic services became invaluable, while people whose only skill was political maneuvering became expendable. The religious establishments found their authority simultaneously enhanced and undermined by the crisis. People who had ignored church teachings for years suddenly became desperately interested in salvation, but they also demanded practical assistance that required resources and organization rather than prayer and contemplation. Bishops and abbots discovered that their influence depended less on theological expertise and more on their ability to organize food distribution, medical care, and burial services for communities that were disintegrating under pressure. The plague created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed since the empire's founding. Administrative positions that would normally be passed down through family connections became available to anyone who could read, write, and function effectively in an environment where death was a daily presence. Military commands went to officers who could maintain unit cohesion when traditional discipline was breaking down. Even palace positions opened up for people who had never been considered eligible for court service. But the most significant change was psychological rather than social or economic. The plague forced everyone to confront the reality that human plans and ambitions were ultimately meaningless in the face of forces that couldn't be negotiated with, bribed, or intimidated. This didn't make people less ambitious. If anything, it made them more desperate to achieve their goals while they still had time. But it changed the calculation of risk versus reward in ways that made previously unthinkable actions suddenly seem reasonable. The conspiracy against Theodora had been built on the assumption that political change would occur gradually through careful maneuvering and alliance building. The plague destroyed that assumption by demonstrating that dramatic change could happen overnight through mechanisms that had nothing to do with human agency. This created both opportunities and dangers for everyone involved in palace politics. But it particularly benefited people who were comfortable with improvisation and rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. The Empress used the crisis to implement policies that would have been impossible during normal times. She restructured administrative departments, redistributed resources between military and civilian priorities, and established new channels of communication that bypassed traditional bureaucratic procedures. Her justification was always the immediate needs created by the epidemic, but the long-term effect was to create systems that increased her personal control over imperial operations. The most disturbing aspect of the plague's impact was how it revealed the arbitrary nature of survival in a world where competence and virtue provided no protection against random catastrophe. Palace officials who had spent decades building careers through careful planning and strategic thinking died within days of contracting the disease, while others who had no particular qualifications beyond physical resistance inherited their positions and responsibilities. Merit ceased to be the primary factor in advancement, which created opportunities for people who had been excluded from power by traditional qualification systems. In the shadow of death, the living revealed their truest selves. Some people became heroes, risking their own lives to help others and maintain essential services under impossible conditions. Others became predators, using the breakdown of normal oversight to engage in corruption and exploitation that would have been detected and punished during stable times. Most people simply tried to survive while maintaining enough humanity to live with their choices when the crisis eventually ended. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the assumption that the future would be similar to the past. The conspiracy against Theodora had been based on traditional patterns of palace politics, but those patterns no longer applied in a world where the fundamental conditions of existence had been transformed overnight. The rules of the game were changing faster than anyone could adapt, which meant that victory would go to whoever could abandon their assumptions most quickly and completely. The general who had humbled the Vandals in Africa and terrified the Goths in Italy was brought down by a woman's whisper and an emperor's doubt. Belisarius had spent his career believing that military competence would protect him from political persecution, but he was about to discover that in the Byzantine Empire, success on the battlefield could be more dangerous than failure, because victory made powerful people nervous about your ultimate intentions. The accusations began as rumors so subtle that they seemed like compliments. Palace courtiers spoke admiringly of Belisarius's loyalty to the empire, but with just enough emphasis on the word empire to suggest that his loyalty to the emperor might be a separate question. They praised his military genius while wondering aloud whether such talents might be better suited to independent command, rather than service to masters who couldn't appreciate his capabilities. The poisonous suggestions were wrapped in language so respectful that they couldn't be challenged without appearing paranoid. Antonina had positioned herself at the center of this psychological assassination, but her role was so carefully disguised that she appeared to be defending her husband while actually orchestrating his destruction. She shared confidential conversations with other palace ladies, always framing her concerns in terms of worry about the general's safety rather than criticism of his judgment. She expressed fears that his enemies were plotting against him, which had the effect of making everyone wonder who those enemies might be and whether their concerns were justified. The military evidence was selectively presented to support predetermined conclusions. Belisarius's victories were reinterpreted as signs of dangerous ambition rather than loyal service. His popularity with his troops became evidence of potential disloyalty to imperial authority. His ability to achieve success with limited resources was presented as proof that he was holding back his true capabilities for his own purposes. Every strength was transformed into a suspicious weakness through the alchemy of palace interpretation. Emperor Justinian's illness during the plague had created the perfect opportunity for testing the general's loyalty. While the emperor lay unconscious, various court factions had approached Belisarius with suggestions about how the empire should be governed if Justinian died. His refusal to engage in these discussions was initially seen as appropriate loyalty, but it was later reinterpreted as evidence that he was conducting his own private negotiations while maintaining the appearance of proper behavior. The financial audit of the general's accounts revealed exactly what palace accountants had been instructed to find. Military campaigns generate enormous cash flows through payments for supplies, equipment, and mercenary services, creating numerous opportunities for creative bookkeeping that could be interpreted as either efficient administration or personal enrichment. Belisarius had operated according to the same financial practices that other generals used, but his records were examined with a level of scrutiny that would have revealed irregularities in anyone's accounts. The most devastating evidence was manufactured through the careful editing of official correspondence. Letters that Belisarius had written to subordinate commanders were presented with critical context removed, making routine military communications appear to be coded messages about political plans. His discussions of troop movements and supply requirements were interpreted as preparations for actions that had nothing to do with imperial orders. The same intelligence techniques that were used against foreign enemies were turned against the empire's most successful general. Theodora's role in the general's downfall was masterfully indirect. She never made direct accusations or demanded specific actions against him. Instead, she created an environment where other people felt compelled to demonstrate their loyalty to her by attacking someone who was perceived as a threat to her interests. The Empress understood that the most effective assassinations were performed by people who believed they were acting from their own motivations rather than following orders. The legal proceedings were conducted with scrupulous attention to proper procedures, which made the predetermined outcome appear to be the result of careful investigation rather than political persecution. Witnesses were called who testified about conversations they had overheard, documents they had seen, and behaviors they had observed. The fact that these witnesses had been carefully coached and their testimony had been coordinated was never mentioned in the official records. Belisarius's defense was hampered by his fundamental inability to understand how palace politics worked. He presented evidence of his military achievements as if competence were relevant to accusations of disloyalty. He called character witnesses who testified to his integrity as if personal virtue mattered in cases where political necessity demanded a specific outcome. He argued his case as if logic and evidence would determine the verdict rather than factors that were never mentioned in the courtroom. The general's downfall served multiple purposes for different people, with different motives. Theodora eliminated a potential threat while demonstrating her power to destroy even the most successful imperial servants. Justinian removed a subordinate whose popularity might eventually become dangerous while appearing to act on objective evidence, rather than personal insecurity. Various court factions proved their loyalty to the empress while eliminating a competitor for imperial favor and resources. But the most tragic aspect of the general's destruction was how it revealed the essential impossibility of loyal service in a system where loyalty itself was considered evidence of potential betrayal. Belisarius had devoted his career to expanding and protecting the empire, but his success had made him too valuable to trust and too dangerous to ignore. The very qualities that made him an asset to the empire made him a liability to the people who controlled it. The military consequences were immediate and predictable. Other generals understood the lesson and began modifying their behavior to avoid appearing too successful or too popular with their troops. Military efficiency declined as commanders focused more on political survival than tactical effectiveness. The empire's enemies quickly recognized that Byzantine military leadership had been compromised by internal conflicts that had nothing to do with external threats. The psychological impact on Belisarius himself was devastating but private. A man who had spent his adult life believing that service to the empire was the highest form of honor discovered that the empire he had served was perfectly willing to destroy him, to protect people who had never risked anything for its preservation. The general who had conquered kingdoms was conquered by the realization that loyalty and competence were not just insufficient protection against political persecution, they were often the primary causes of it. But the general's downfall was only the beginning of something far more sinister. His destruction had established precedents and revealed capabilities that would be applied to other targets who had committed the crime of being too successful, too popular, or simply too visible to people who preferred to operate in shadows. The machinery of political assassination had been tested, refined, and proven effective against the most powerful person who could realistically be targeted. Now it was ready for use against enemies who lacked even his advantages. In the abandoned cistern beneath the church of St. Irene, two men who had spent years trying to destroy each other were learning to coordinate their hatred toward a more dangerous common enemy. The arch ceiling dripped with condensation that sounded like whispered prayers, but the words being spoken in the darkness had nothing to do with forgiveness or salvation. This was where former enemies were discovering that shared fear could create bonds stronger than friendship and more reliable than love. Narses the eunuch had arrived first, his soft footsteps echoing in the vast underground chamber like the heartbeat of some stone creature dreaming in the depths beneath Constantinople. He had chosen this location because its acoustic properties made eavesdropping impossible, while its religious context provided perfect cover for a meeting between people who had no obvious reason to be in the same place at the same time. The cistern was officially maintained by the church, but it had been empty for decades, making it the perfect space for conversations that couldn't be overheard by human ears. Senator Hypatius had descended through the narrow entrance with the careful movements of a man who understood that this meeting represented either salvation or destruction, depending on factors that were largely beyond his control. As one of the few remaining members of the old senatorial families, he possessed resources and connections that could be valuable to the right allies, but he also represented a form of legitimacy that made him dangerous to people who had risen to power through less traditional channels. The alliance being forged in the candlelit darkness was built on mathematical logic rather than emotional connection. Both men had recognized that Theodora's power had reached a level where individual opposition was not just futile, but suicidal. She had demonstrated with Belisarius that she could destroy anyone who posed a potential threat. regardless of their service to the empire or their loyalty to the emperor. The only rational response was coordination between people who would normally compete for the same resources and opportunities. Their shared intelligence had revealed the true scope of the Empress's network and capabilities. She wasn't just winning individual political battles, she was systematically restructuring the empire's power relationships to ensure that all authority flowed through her rather than through traditional institutions. The Senate, the military hierarchy, the religious establishment, and even the imperial bureaucracy were being transformed into instruments of her personal will, rather than independent sources of power that could provide checks on imperial authority. The financial resources available to their alliance were more substantial than either man had initially realized. Narses had access to commercial networks throughout the Mediterranean, while Hypatia controlled agricultural estates that generated enormous revenues through careful management and strategic crop selection. Their combined wealth was sufficient to fund operations that would have been impossible for either man individually, but they were careful to ensure that their cooperation couldn't be detected through financial records or audit procedures. The military dimension was the most delicate aspect of their collaboration. Neither man had direct command authority over imperial forces, but both had relationships with officers who were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the political purges that had eliminated Belisarius and other competent leaders. These officers weren't potential rebels, they were professionals who understood that the empire's military effectiveness was being sacrificed to palace politics in ways that endangered everyone's long-term survival. Their communication system had been designed to avoid the surveillance networks that monitored conventional palace correspondence. Messages were embedded in commercial documents, religious texts, and even architectural plans for building projects that provided innocent explanations for why specific people needed to exchange detailed information. The system was so sophisticated that individual messages appeared meaningless to interceptors who didn't possess the proper decryption methods. The most dangerous element of their plan was psychological rather than logistical. They were attempting to coordinate opposition to someone who had spent her entire career learning to read human motivations with deadly precision. Every move they made had to account for the possibility that their true intentions were already known, and that their alliance was being manipulated for purposes they couldn't perceive. Paranoia wasn't just reasonable in their situation, it was essential for survival. The religious component provided both cover and genuine motivation for their activities. Neither man was driven primarily by theological concerns, but both understood that Theodora's manipulation of religious authority threatened the independence of institutions that had provided stability for centuries. Her use of doctrinal disputes to eliminate political opponents was transforming the church into a weapon rather than a spiritual authority, which endangered the entire foundation of Byzantine legitimacy. Their meetings in the cistern had developed their own ritualistic quality over the months of careful planning. Each session began with a systematic review of intelligence gathered since their previous meeting, continued with analysis of changing political conditions, and concluded with specific assignments designed to advance their shared objectives without exposing either participant to unnecessary risks. The format was as precise as a military briefing, but the stakes were higher than any battle either man had previously experienced. The irony of their collaboration wasn't lost on either participant. Narses had spent years building influence through his position as a permanent insider who could be trusted because he had no traditional ambitions. Hypatia had maintained his relevance through connections to historical legitimacy that predated the current imperial dynasty. Now they were working together to oppose someone whose rise to power had made their individual strengths irrelevant, and their survival dependent on their ability to function as a team. The timeline for their operation was being dictated by external factors that neither man could control. The plague had created opportunities for rapid political change, but it had also made long-term planning more difficult, because the fundamental conditions of imperial politics were shifting faster than anyone could adapt. They needed to act quickly enough to take advantage of current circumstances, but carefully enough to avoid the mistakes that had destroyed other opposition efforts. Their greatest strength was also their greatest vulnerability. The fact that their alliance was unexpected and unprecedented meant that their opponents wouldn't be prepared for coordinated action from people who had never worked together before. But it also meant that they had no experience cooperating under pressure, and no established procedures for dealing with crises that might require immediate improvisation. They were creating their partnership while simultaneously implementing it under conditions where failure would mean death. They thought they were hunting the Empress, but she had been setting the trap all along. The cistern that seemed like the perfect hiding place had been designed by architects who understood that every space in Constantinople served multiple purposes. The conversations that felt completely private were being monitored through techniques that were older than the empire itself. The alliance that appeared to be their secret weapon was actually the mechanism through which their most dangerous enemy was gathering the intelligence she needed to destroy them both. The Empress had been waiting for this moment with the patience of a spider who understands that the most dangerous prey always betrays itself through overconfidence. 3 months of careful observation had revealed not just the existence of the conspiracy against her, but its complete structure, membership, timeline, and objectives. Now, as dawn broke over Constantinople on the morning that would later be remembered as the Day of Silent Knives, she was ready to demonstrate what happened to people who mistook her restraint for weakness. Her response began not with violence, but with theatre, a performance so subtle that most of the audience never realized they were watching a carefully choreographed demonstration of power. The morning's court session proceeded according to normal protocol, with petitioners presenting their requests and officials delivering their reports. But observers who understood the hidden language of palace politics could read a different message in the Empress's choice of jewelry, the timing of her responses, and the almost imperceptible changes in her facial expressions when certain names were mentioned. The first move was against Senator Hypatius, but it came disguised as an honor rather than an attack. The Empress announced that she was commissioning a comprehensive audit of senatorial finances to identify resources that could be redirected toward plague relief efforts. The audit would be conducted by financial experts selected for their discretion and thoroughness, and it would begin immediately with the senator's own holdings, as an example of transparent cooperation with imperial policy. By the time Hypatius understood what was happening, auditors were already examining records that would reveal connections he had thought were perfectly concealed. Narses received a different but equally devastating form of attention. The Empress requested his assistance with a special investigation into intelligence security within the palace, specifically focusing on identifying potential vulnerabilities in communication systems that might be exploited by hostile forces. His expertise would be essential for protecting the empire against enemies who might attempt to use the palace's own surveillance capabilities for treasonous purposes. The eunuch realized with growing horror that he was being asked to demonstrate exactly how his own operations worked, under the guise of helping to defend against the very activities he had been conducting. But the most sophisticated element of her counterattack was how she turned the conspirators' religious justifications against them. Rather than defending her theological positions through scholarly debate, she announced that she was convening a special council of Eastern bishops to address concerns that had been raised about doctrinal purity within the imperial administration. The bishops who had been secretly coordinating with her enemies suddenly found themselves in the position of having to publicly defend their theological positions to colleagues who had been carefully selected for their loyalty to the Empress's interpretation of correct doctrine. The financial dimension of her response revealed capabilities that even her closest allies hadn't suspected. Commercial enterprises throughout the Mediterranean that had appeared to be independent businesses were revealed to be components of an economic network that could be activated for political purposes. Ships carrying grain to Rome developed sudden mechanical problems that delayed their arrival. Caravans transporting silk to northern markets were subjected to unexpected tax inspections that tied up their cargo for weeks. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Opposition to the Empress carried economic consequences that extended far beyond the boundaries of Constantinople. Military commanders who had been considering their options received visits from trusted subordinates who shared disturbing intelligence about potential threats to imperial security. These conversations were always framed in terms of loyalty to the empire rather than personal loyalty to the Empress, but the underlying message was unmistakable. Officers who had been thinking about political alternatives suddenly found themselves wondering whether their communications were as secure as they had assumed, and whether their hesitation to commit to either side had already been interpreted as evidence of disloyalty by people who were tracking such things. The intelligence network that had been tracking the conspiracy revealed its true scope through a series of strategic leaks that appeared accidental, but were actually carefully calculated. Information about the secret meetings in St. Stephen's Chapel reached people who hadn't been directly involved but who had connections to the participants. Evidence of financial coordination between supposedly independent actors began surfacing in contexts that suggested broader patterns of hidden cooperation. The effect was to make everyone who had any connection to the conspiracy wonder what else was known and by whom. The legal mechanisms were activated with surgical precision, rather than making dramatic arrests that would have created martyrs and inspired sympathy. The Empress initiated administrative procedures that appeared routine but carried devastating practical consequences. Tax reassessments, permit reviews, and bureaucratic audits created immediate problems for people whose activities required official approval or government cooperation. The message was that opposition carried costs that would be imposed through perfectly legal channels that couldn't be challenged without appearing to oppose legitimate government functions. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of her response was how she made it clear that the conspiracy had been under observation from its inception. Details about private conversations were mentioned in casual contexts that left the participants wondering who else had been present. Information that should have been known only to inner circle members appeared in official documents that suggested much broader surveillance capabilities. The realization that their most secret activities had been transparent to their target was more demoralizing than any direct attack could have been. The Empress's counterattack succeeded because it attacked the conspiracy's fundamental assumptions about how power worked in the Byzantine system. The conspirators had planned their operation based on traditional models of palace politics, where opposing factions competed according to established rules and recognized limits. They hadn't prepared for an opponent who was willing to use capabilities that exceeded their understanding of what was possible or acceptable within the framework of imperial politics. The religious authorities who had provided theological justification for opposition to the Empress discovered that their spiritual authority provided no protection against accusations of secular disloyalty. The financial networks that had seemed secure were revealed to be vulnerable to disruption through economic pressure that had nothing to do with legal prosecution. The military connections that had appeared reliable proved to be compromised by intelligence operations that had been monitoring them for months. One by one, the hunters became the hunted. But the transformation wasn't accomplished through violent confrontation. It was achieved through the methodical application of pressure that forced each conspirator to choose between escalating their opposition at enormous personal cost, or abandoning their allies to protect their own interests. The Empress understood that the most effective way to destroy a conspiracy was to make continued participation more dangerous than betrayal, which would cause the organization to collapse through internal betrayal rather than external attack. The demonstration was designed not just to eliminate current threats, but to deter future opposition by establishing new standards for what constituted acceptable political behavior. Anyone who was considering challenging the Empress's authority would now have to account for capabilities that had been revealed and techniques that had been proven effective. The cost of opposition had been dramatically increased, while the probability of success had been reduced to levels that would discourage all but the most desperate or irrational challengers. Constantinople had seen many nights of political violence, but none had been orchestrated with the mathematical precision that characterized the 48 hours beginning at sunset on October 15. As darkness fell over the Golden Horn, 6 separate operations began unfolding simultaneously across the city, each appearing unrelated to casual observers, but all coordinated according to a master plan that had been months in development. The Empress, who had learned strategy in brothels and bear pits, was about to demonstrate that survival skills acquired in desperate circumstances could be applied with devastating effectiveness to imperial politics. The first arrests were made at the Church of Saints Peter and Paul, where 3 bishops were taken into custody during evening prayers. The charges were routine, administrative irregularities in the management of church properties, but the timing was clearly intended to send a message about the relationship between religious authority and imperial power. The bishops had been key figures in the theological opposition to Theodora's religious policies, but they were being prosecuted for secular crimes that had nothing to do with doctrinal disputes. The message was that spiritual authority provided no immunity from earthly consequences. Simultaneously, Narses discovered that his private chambers had been searched by imperial security personnel who possessed authorization documents that he himself had signed several weeks earlier during a routine review of palace security procedures. The search was ostensibly part of a broader investigation into intelligence leaks that threatened imperial security, but the specific documents that were confiscated revealed the existence of communication networks that he had spent years developing. The eunuch realized with growing panic that his signature on the authorization papers had made him complicit in the destruction of his own operations. The financial attacks were launched through commercial networks that struck at targets throughout the Mediterranean basin. Ships owned by companies with hidden connections to the conspiracy suffered mechanical failures that required expensive repairs in ports where labor costs were carefully calculated to exceed the value of their cargo. Caravans carrying goods for merchants who had provided financial support to opposition activities were subjected to tax inspections that revealed irregularities requiring immediate payment of penalties that consumed their entire working capital. The economic warfare was conducted through perfectly legal mechanisms that left no evidence of political motivation. Senator Hypatius received visitors at his estate outside the city, not armed soldiers, but bureaucratic officials who presented documentation proving that his property had been illegally purchased using funds that had been embezzled from imperial accounts during his grandfather's tenure as provincial governor 60 years earlier. The legal precedents were obscure but valid, and the evidence had been carefully assembled to support claims for restitution that would bankrupt his family while transferring their holdings to the imperial treasury. The senator was being destroyed through historical research rather than contemporary accusation, but the most sophisticated operation was being conducted within the palace itself, where Theodora was hosting a dinner party that had been planned as a celebration of the empire's recovery from the plague. The guest list included everyone who remained from the original conspiracy, plus carefully selected witnesses whose presence would be essential for establishing the official version of events that would be recorded for posterity. The Empress was creating a historical narrative while simultaneously eliminating the people who could challenge that narrative. Military commanders throughout the empire received sealed orders that were to be opened only in the event of communication disruption with Constantinople. The orders contained detailed instructions for maintaining imperial authority during transition periods, but they also included lists of individuals who were to be detained immediately if they appeared in the commander's territories. The military network that had been partially compromised by the conspiracy was being used to implement security measures that would prevent the conspirators from escaping through channels they thought were secure. The plague had created perfect cover for operations that would have been difficult to explain during normal times. Deaths that might have appeared suspicious were easily attributed to disease, while the general breakdown of routine administrative procedures meant that unusual activities were less likely to attract attention. The Empress was using the crisis that had threatened her power as a tool for consolidating that power in ways that would have been impossible under ordinary circumstances. The intelligence operations revealed their full scope through a series of seemingly accidental disclosures that demonstrated comprehensive penetration of the conspiracy's security measures. Private conversations were quoted in official documents, financial transactions were referenced in diplomatic correspondence, and personal details were mentioned in contexts that proved someone had been monitoring activities that the participants had assumed were completely confidential. The psychological impact was as devastating as any physical attack. The most disturbing revelation was that several key members of the conspiracy had been reporting to Imperial intelligence throughout the entire operation. These double agents hadn't been recruited through coercion or bribery. They had been patriots who had participated in the conspiracy specifically to gather information about its scope and capabilities. Their involvement had allowed the Empress to monitor the opposition's planning in real time while feeding disinformation that had shaped their strategy in ways that served her interests rather than their own. The religious dimension reached its climax when Eastern bishops who had been secretly coordinating with the conspiracy publicly denounced their Western colleagues for theological positions that endangered the unity of the empire. The denunciations were delivered with perfect doctrinal justification and appeared to be spontaneous expressions of religious conviction, but their timing and coordination proved that the Empress had been manipulating the theological dispute to serve her political objectives. As dawn approached, the scope of the coordinated operation became clear to survivors who were in positions to observe the overall pattern. The conspiracy that had taken months to develop had been dismantled in a single night through techniques that combined traditional political prosecution with innovative applications of imperial authority. But the most chilling aspect was the realization that the entire opposition movement might have been allowed to develop specifically to identify all potential threats and eliminate them simultaneously. The legal proceedings that followed were conducted with scrupulous attention to proper procedures, but the outcomes were predetermined by evidence that had been carefully assembled to support the charges. Witnesses testified about activities they had observed. Documents were presented that proved coordination between supposedly independent actors, and financial records revealed patterns of behavior that supported accusations of treason. The Empress had created a comprehensive legal justification for actions that had been taken for purely political reasons. By dawn, half the court would be dead, or in exile, but which half remained a mystery until the final roll call revealed who had survived the night, and who had fallen victim to their own ambitions. The Empress had eliminated her enemies, while establishing new standards for political behavior that would deter future challenges to her authority. The Night of Long Shadows had ended, but its consequences would shape imperial politics for generations. In the pre-dawn darkness of his private chamber, Justinian sat alone with the weight of an empire, and the burden of a choice that would define not just his reign but his soul. The reports scattered across his desk told a story that he had been refusing to read for months. His wife had become something more dangerous than an empress, and something more necessary than any individual should be to the survival of an empire. The candlelight flickered across documents that proved she had saved the Byzantine state by methods that called into question whether what she had saved was still worth preserving. The military reports were unambiguous. The conspiracy against Theodora had been real, comprehensive, and capable of destroying the imperial government if it had been allowed to proceed. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial coordination between powerful families, religious authority being weaponized for political purposes, and military commanders being approached with offers that amounted to treason. His wife hadn't manufactured a crisis to justify her actions. She had responded to genuine threats that could have ended their dynasty and plunged the empire into civil war. But the methods she had used to eliminate these threats represented a fundamental transformation of how imperial power functioned. The traditional balance between emperor, senate, military, and religious authorities had been replaced by a system where all power flowed through a single person who was accountable only to her own judgment. She had saved the empire by making herself indispensable to its operation, which meant that removing her would be as dangerous as the original conspiracy had been. The financial analysis was even more disturbing. Theodora's economic operations extended throughout the Mediterranean in ways that made her simultaneously essential to imperial revenue and capable of independent action that could survive the fall of the government she supposedly served. She had created parallel systems that could function without official authorization, which gave her capabilities that no empress in Byzantine history had ever possessed. She was no longer just his wife and partner. She was a separate center of power that happened to be aligned with his interests. The religious implications were perhaps the most complex aspect of his dilemma. Her manipulation of theological disputes had been brilliantly effective, but it had also corrupted the spiritual foundations of imperial legitimacy. She had turned sacred doctrine into political weapons, which meant that future religious authorities would always be vulnerable to similar manipulation by people who understood the techniques she had perfected. The church that emerged from her interventions would be stronger in the short term but fundamentally compromised in its ability to provide independent moral authority. His personal letters from this period reveal a man torn between admiration and terror at what his wife had become. She had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his own understanding of what was possible within the constraints of Byzantine politics. Her intelligence network was more comprehensive than the official imperial intelligence service. Her financial resources were more flexible than the imperial treasury. Her political skills were more sophisticated than those of people who had been born into the aristocratic families that supposedly monopolized such talents. The plague had complicated his choice by demonstrating that she was capable of effective leadership during genuine crises. While he had been unconscious and near death, she had maintained imperial authority and organized relief efforts that had saved thousands of lives. Her actions during the epidemic had proven that her power was not just destructive, but genuinely constructive when applied to problems that required rapid decision-making and resource coordination. The empire had functioned better under her sole leadership than it typically did under their joint rule, but the precedent she had established was terrifying in its implications for future imperial governance. She had proven that a sufficiently skilled and ruthless individual could accumulate power that made them effectively immune to traditional checks and balances. If she could do this, so could other people with similar capabilities but different objectives. The techniques she had perfected for eliminating opposition could be used by future power seekers to establish tyrannies that would make the current situation seem benevolent by comparison. The military commanders who remained loyal were simultaneously reassuring and troubling. They supported Theodora because they understood that she had eliminated threats to imperial security that they hadn't been capable of handling through conventional means. But their support was based on effectiveness rather than legitimacy, which meant that they would transfer their loyalty to anyone who demonstrated superior capabilities for protecting their interests. The military foundation of imperial power had become pragmatic rather than institutional. The Senate had been effectively neutralized as an independent political force, but the methods used to achieve this neutralization had eliminated an institution that had provided stability for centuries. Future emperors would rule without the constraint of senatorial oversight, but they would also govern without the legitimacy that came from having their policies reviewed by representatives of traditional Roman authority. The immediate benefits were obvious, but the long-term costs were incalculable. His choice was being forced by external pressures that were beyond his control. Other Mediterranean powers were watching Byzantine internal politics with intense interest, looking for signs of weakness that could be exploited through military or economic pressure. Any appearance of internal conflict would invite external intervention that could destroy the empire regardless of who won the domestic power struggle. He had to choose between his wife and his empire's stability, but making either choice would create vulnerabilities that their enemies could exploit. The theological advisors who had survived the recent purges offered conflicting counsel that reflected their own political calculations rather than spiritual wisdom. Some argued that supporting his wife was necessary for imperial unity, while others maintained that her methods had corrupted the religious foundations of legitimate authority. Their advice was useless because they were telling him what they thought he wanted to hear rather than what they believed was true. The historical precedents were ambiguous and contradictory. Previous emperors who had relied too heavily on powerful spouses had often been destroyed by people who used those relationships to attack imperial authority. But emperors who had abandoned effective allies for the sake of traditional political balance had frequently fallen victim to enemies who were more ruthless than the allies they had rejected. There was no clear guidance from past experience about how to handle a situation where personal loyalty and political necessity demanded contradictory response. The realization that was slowly forming in his mind was that the choice itself might be irrelevant. Theodora had accumulated enough independent power that his decision to support or oppose her would not determine the outcome of their conflict. She had created systems that could function without his approval and resources that didn't depend on his authorization. The emperor, who was supposed to be the ultimate authority in the empire, had discovered that his authority was now subordinate to capabilities that he didn't control and couldn't revoke. His choice would echo through history in ways he never imagined. But at the time, it felt like surrendering to forces that had already made the decision for him. The empire that he had inherited was gone, replaced by something more efficient, but fundamentally different. The question was no longer whether to support his wife, but whether to accept that the Byzantine Empire had evolved into something that would survive his death, but might not resemble anything his predecessors would have recognized as legitimate imperial government. The techniques that Theodora perfected in the marble corridors of Constantinople didn't die with the Byzantine Empire. They evolved, adapted, and found new applications in corporate boardrooms, political campaigns, and intelligence operations where the stakes are measured in different currencies, but the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. A walk through the headquarters of any major corporation or government agency today would reveal the same architectural psychology, the same information warfare, and the same careful management of human ambition that characterized the Sacred Palace 15 centuries ago. Modern office buildings employ the same spatial manipulation that Byzantine architects used to create psychological pressure and enforce hierarchies. Corner offices aren't just status symbols, they're surveillance positions that allow occupants to monitor foot traffic and observe interaction patterns throughout their territory. Open floor plans that appear to promote collaboration actually make private conversation impossible, forcing employees to conduct sensitive discussions in monitored conference rooms or through digital channels that can be tracked and analyzed. The physical environment shapes behavior in ways that serve organizational intelligence gathering while maintaining the appearance of transparency and accessibility. Corporate intelligence gathering has become as sophisticated as anything Narses could have imagined, but it operates through digital surveillance rather than human networks. Employee communications are monitored through email systems. Productivity is tracked through software that measures keystroke patterns and screen time, and social relationships are mapped through analysis of collaboration data and meeting attendance. The information that results from this surveillance is used to identify potential internal threats, predict resignation patterns, and maintain competitive advantages through insights about personnel decisions at rival organizations. The financial warfare that Theodora used against her enemies has been systematized into modern economic statecraft and corporate competition. Companies use regulatory capture, supply chain manipulation, and strategic litigation to eliminate competitors without engaging in direct confrontation. Nations employ sanctions, trade restrictions, and currency manipulation to achieve political objectives, while maintaining the appearance of economic rather than military action. The techniques are more subtle than Byzantine gold hoarding, but the strategic principles are identical. Political campaigns have become exercises in psychological manipulation that would have impressed the Empress, who turned street-level survival skills into instruments of imperial control. Opposition research functions as character assassination through selective presentation of factual information. Message discipline ensures that all communications reinforce predetermined narratives regardless of their relationship to actual policy positions. Social media operations create artificial grassroots movements that appear spontaneous while being centrally coordinated and professionally managed. The religious dimensions of Byzantine power struggles have been replaced by ideological warfare that serves the same functions through secular means. Academic institutions, media organizations, and advocacy groups provide the intellectual authority that churches once supplied for political positions. Doctrinal disputes about economic theory, social policy, and international relations are conducted with the same intensity and personal stakes that characterized theological controversies in Constantinople. The terminology has changed, but the psychology remains identical. Modern intelligence agencies operate according to principles that Theodora would have recognized immediately. Information is gathered through human sources who don't realize they're providing intelligence, technical surveillance that remains invisible to its targets, and analysis that identifies patterns of behavior, suggesting coordination between supposedly independent actors. The most effective operations maintain perfect deniability while achieving specific political objectives through techniques that appear unrelated to intelligence activities. The corporate environments where these techniques are most visible combine the worst aspects of Byzantine palace politics with the efficiency of modern information technology. Employees learn to communicate through coded language that can be interpreted multiple ways depending on the audience. Alliance patterns shift according to quarterly performance reviews and reorganization announcements. Career advancement requires skills in reading organizational politics that have nothing to do with job performance, but everything to do with survival in systems designed to eliminate internal threats. Technology has amplified rather than eliminated the human dynamics that made Byzantine politics so psychologically destructive. Social media creates the same paranoid atmosphere that physical surveillance produced in the sacred palace, where every interaction is potentially being monitored and recorded for future use against the participants. Digital communication allows for the same selective editing and context manipulation that made imperial correspondence such effective weapons for character assassination and political persecution. The financial systems that enable modern power accumulation operate through the same principles of hidden ownership and parallel networks that characterized Theodora's economic operations. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex investment structures create the same opacity that allowed Byzantine power brokers to coordinate resources while maintaining the appearance of independence. The scale is larger and the mechanisms are more sophisticated, but the strategic objectives are identical. Perhaps the most disturbing parallel is how modern democratic institutions have been vulnerable to the same forms of capture and manipulation that destroyed the independent authority of Byzantine senates, military hierarchies, and religious establishments. Regulatory agencies become advocates for the industries they're supposed to monitor. Legislative bodies are influenced through lobbying operations that create the appearance of independent policy analysis while serving predetermined political objectives. Electoral systems are manipulated through techniques that maintain the form of democratic participation while ensuring that outcomes serve the interests of people who understand how to game the system. The psychological profile of individuals who successfully navigate these environments would be familiar to anyone who studied the palace politicians of Constantinople. They combine genuine competence with strategic ruthlessness, public charm with private calculation, and the ability to maintain multiple relationships that serve different purposes without allowing emotional attachment to compromise strategic judgment. These are the same personality characteristics that allowed people like Theodora to rise from desperate circumstances to positions of ultimate power. But the most chilling parallel is how these systems create their own justification through their effectiveness at achieving short-term objectives, while destroying the institutional foundations that make long-term stability possible. Byzantine techniques for eliminating political opposition were brilliantly successful until they eliminated the empire itself. Modern applications of similar methods are producing similar results. Highly effective responses to immediate challenges that create conditions for eventual systemic collapse. The names have changed, but the game remains exactly the same. The only difference is that today's practitioners have access to tools that make Theodora's capabilities seem primitive by comparison, while operating in systems that provide even fewer constraints on the accumulation and exercise of power than existed in the Byzantine Empire. The empress who learned to survive in Constantinople's underworld would recognize the dynamics immediately, but she might be impressed by how much more sophisticated the techniques have become. The most haunting aspect of Theodora's story isn't what we know, it's what we can never know, because the people who possessed the most crucial information took their secrets to graves that have been lost for over 1,000 years. Modern archaeology can tell us about the physical spaces where these events unfolded, and psychological analysis can help us understand the human dynamics that drove the conflicts, but the essential mysteries remain as impenetrable today as they were to the people who lived through these events. The Empress's true origins remain disputed, despite decades of scholarly investigation. The official sources were written by people who had political reasons to present specific versions of her background, while the hostile accounts were produced by enemies who were equally motivated to distort the facts for their own purposes. Archaeological evidence from the neighborhoods where she supposedly grew up has been destroyed by centuries of urban development, and the theatrical records that might have documented her early career were never preserved with the same care given to more respectable forms of historical documentation. Recent discoveries in Egyptian monasteries have revealed correspondence between religious authorities that suggests Theodora's theological positions were more sophisticated than previously understood. The letters indicate that she was conducting direct negotiations with Monophysite leaders in ways that bypassed imperial diplomatic channels, but the fragmentary nature of these documents makes it impossible to determine whether she was acting with Justinian's knowledge or conducting independent foreign policy that could have constituted treason under different circumstances. DNA analysis of human remains found in the imperial section of Constantinople's ancient cemeteries has produced intriguing but inconclusive results. Several individuals buried with imperial honors show genetic markers that are inconsistent with Byzantine aristocratic lineages, suggesting that the palace population included people from backgrounds that were never officially acknowledged. But the degraded condition of the samples and the lack of comparative genetic data from known imperial family members makes definitive identification impossible. The financial records that survived the empire's collapse provide tantalizing glimpses of economic operations that were far more complex than traditional history suggested. Commercial documents from Alexandria, Ravenna, and other major trading centers reference business relationships with entities that appear to be connected to the imperial court, but the corporate structures involved used coding systems that remain undecipherable. Modern forensic accounting techniques have identified patterns that suggest systematic wealth accumulation and transfer, but the specific mechanisms and ultimate beneficiaries remain unknown. The most sophisticated analysis of the palace architecture has revealed acoustic and optical features that exceeded the capabilities previously attributed to Byzantine engineering. Ground-penetrating radar has identified chamber systems that weren't included in any surviving architectural plans, suggesting that the surveillance capabilities of the sacred palace were even more extensive than the historical sources indicated. But these discoveries raise questions about who designed these systems, how they were constructed without leaving documentary evidence, and what other capabilities might have existed that haven't been discovered yet. Linguistic analysis of surviving correspondence has identified writing patterns that suggest some key documents attributed to specific individuals were actually produced by people with different educational backgrounds and regional origins. The implications are disturbing. Either the imperial court included ghostwriters whose existence was never officially acknowledged, or crucial historical sources were fabricated by people who had access to official communication channels and intimate knowledge of palace politics. The plague records have been subjected to modern epidemiological analysis that reveals death patterns inconsistent with natural disease transmission. The mortality rates in specific neighborhoods and among particular social groups suggest that the epidemic was either more selective than random chance would predict, or that factors beyond disease were influencing who survived and who died. But the evidence is circumstantial, and alternative explanations could account for the statistical anomalies without requiring deliberate intervention. Psychological profiles constructed using modern criminal psychology techniques suggest personality characteristics in key historical figures that are consistent with specific forms of mental illness or neurological conditions that weren't recognized or documented by Byzantine medical authorities. These profiles help explain behavioral patterns that seemed irrational to contemporary observers, but they also raise questions about how much of imperial politics was driven by psychological factors that the participants themselves didn't understand. The most intriguing recent discovery involves astronomical calculations that suggest certain key events were timed to coincide with celestial phenomena that would have been visible to educated observers throughout the Mediterranean. The precision required for this coordination implies access to astronomical knowledge and computational capabilities that exceeded what was officially available to Byzantine scholars, but the evidence is too fragmentary to determine whether this represents sophisticated planning or simple coincidence. Modern intelligence analysis techniques applied to surviving correspondence networks, have identified communication patterns that suggest the existence of information sharing systems that operated according to principles more sophisticated than previously understood. The patterns are consistent with modern intelligence operations, but they could also reflect natural human networking behaviors under conditions of political stress. The ambiguity is frustrating but probably permanent. Perhaps the most disturbing question involves the ultimate fate of several key figures whose disappearances were never satisfactorily explained by contemporary sources. Archaeological investigations have failed to locate burial sites for people who should have been interred with appropriate ceremony, while documentary evidence suggests they continued to influence events after their supposed deaths. The possibilities range from successful escapes to witness protection programs that were more sophisticated than anything previously attributed to Byzantine capabilities. The theological manuscripts that provided justification for political actions have been subjected to textual analysis that reveals layers of editing and interpolation that weren't apparent to earlier scholars. Some passages appear to have been added or modified to support predetermined conclusions, while others contain references to sources that may never have existed. The implications extend beyond individual political disputes to questions about the authenticity of religious and historical documents that have been considered authoritative for centuries. The most haunting questions are the ones that can't be answered through any form of evidence, because they involve the private thoughts and motivations of people who lived in circumstances where honesty was literally fatal. What did Theodora really believe about the religious positions she defended so fiercely? Did Justinian ever understand the true extent of his wife's capabilities, or did he remain willfully ignorant because the truth would have been too frightening to acknowledge? Were the conspirators driven by genuine concern for the empire's welfare, or were they rationalizing personal ambitions through appeals to higher principles? These questions remain unanswered, not because the evidence has been lost, but because the people who possessed the answers understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to record, too valuable to share, and too personal to trust to anything more permanent than memory. The empress who transformed herself from a street performer into the ruler of half the known world took the secrets of that transformation with her to a grave that was deliberately designed to be forgotten. The shadows of forgotten power continue to intrigue us because they remind us that the most important aspects of human experience, the private calculations that drive public actions, the personal fears that shape political decisions, and the individual choices that determine collective destiny, remain as mysterious today as they were 15 centuries ago. We can analyze the evidence, construct theories, and develop explanations, but the essential truth about how power actually works and what it costs the people who wield it effectively remains hidden in the space between what we can prove and what we can never know. If these shadows of forgotten power intrigue you, if you want to walk deeper into the labyrinth where history and mystery intertwine, subscribe before the next whisper from the past fades into silence.